The divorce papers hit my desk at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, delivered by a courier who looked almost apologetic. 22 years of marriage reduced to legal jargon and asset division spreadsheets. But it was the handwritten note clipped to the front page that made my blood run cold. Marcus, I'm taking everything. The house, the business, the savings, even your precious vintage car collection. You should have treated me better when you had the chance. Victoria. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at those words until they blurred, my hands trembling as the magnitude of her betrayal sank in. She'd hired the most ruthless divorce attorney in the city, filed for irreconcilable differences, and crafted a strategy designed to leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back. What she didn't know was that her perfect plan had one fatal flaw. For the past 15 years, I'd been quietly moving money offshore, not to hide it from her, but to protect our future from the economic instability that had destroyed so many businesses like mine. That account in the Cayman Islands held $2.8 million, and she had no idea it existed. The law office of Harrison, Walsh Associates occupied the 32nd floor of downtown Seattle's most prestigious building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Elliott Bay that cost more per square foot than most people's annual salaries. I sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room, watching my wife of 22 years discuss my financial destruction with the same casual indifference she used to order coffee. Victoria had changed dramatically over the past 5 years, transforming from the supportive partner who'd helped me build my construction company into someone I barely recognized. Her honey blonde hair was now platinum and perfectly styled. Her modest wardrobe replaced with designer suits that cost more than my employees' monthly salaries. She sat across from me like a corporate predator, flanked by Richard Harrison himself, the divorce attorney whose reputation for leaving husbands financially devastated was legendary throughout the Pacific Northwest. "Mr. Chen," Harrison began, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone accustomed to winning, "my client has been quite generous in her demands. She's willing to settle for 60% of all marital assets, including your construction business, the family home, your investment portfolio, and the vehicle collection you've been accumulating." 60%? I almost laughed at the absurdity. Victoria knew exactly what she was doing. The business I'd built from scratch, starting with a single pickup truck and a tool belt, now employed 47 people and generated annual revenues exceeding $12 million. The house in Bellevue had appreciated to nearly $2 million in value. My classic car collection, a passion project that had taken decades to assemble, was worth at least $800,000. "That seems quite reasonable," my attorney, Jennifer Walsh, replied diplomatically. Jennifer was Harrison's former partner, and their professional relationship had devolved into barely concealed hostility after she'd left his firm to start her own practice. However, my client believes a 50-50 split would be more equitable. Victoria spoke for the first time since we'd sat down, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard during our marriage. Marcus had plenty of opportunities to be equitable during our marriage. He chose to prioritize his business over our relationship. Now he gets to live with the consequences. I studied her face, searching for any trace of the woman I'd fallen in love with at a construction industry conference in 1998. She'd been working as an architect then, passionate about sustainable building practices and affordable housing projects. We'd spent hours discussing how construction and design could create communities rather than just buildings. That woman seemed to have vanished entirely, replaced by someone whose eyes held nothing but cold calculation. "The business generates significant income," Harrison continued, spreading financial documents across the polished table. "Mrs. Chen has been instrumental in its success, hosting client dinners, managing social obligations, and providing the stable home environment that allowed Mr. Chen to focus on expansion." The claim was technically accurate, but laughably incomplete. Victoria had attended perhaps a dozen client events in 22 years, and most of those grudgingly. Her contribution to my business success was minimal at best, but divorce law didn't concern itself with such nuances. Washington state's community property laws meant she was entitled to half of everything acquired during our marriage, regardless of who had actually earned it. "I'm prepared," I said finally, my voice carefully controlled. 50% of documented assets seems fair." Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "Marcus, you don't seem to understand. I have complete financial records for the past 10 years. Bank statements, tax returns, business accounts, investment portfolios. I know exactly what we have, and I'm taking my fair share plus compensation for emotional distress." She was thorough. I had to admit that. During our separation 6 months ago, she'd clearly been documenting everything with forensic precision. What she didn't know was that her financial investigation had barely scratched the surface of our true wealth. The meeting dragged on for another 2 hours, with Harrison outlining a settlement that would leave me with roughly $800,000 and a small rental property in Tacoma. Everything else would become Victoria's property, including the business I'd spent 2 decades building. By the time we left the conference room, I felt like I'd been professionally mugged. Victoria waited until we reached the parking garage before delivering her final blow. "I hope you've learned something from this experience, Marcus. You can't ignore your wife for 20 years and expect her to stay grateful forever." I watched her climb into her new BMW, a car she'd purchased during our separation without consulting me. The woman driving away bore no resemblance to the idealistic architect who'd once sketched affordable housing projects on restaurant napkins while we planned our future together. This stranger had been planning my destruction with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to building designs. The drive home to our soon-to-be former house took 45 minutes through Seattle traffic, giving me plenty of time to process what had just happened. Victoria believed she'd orchestrated the perfect financial ambush, leveraging community property laws and a ruthless attorney to claim the lion's share of our assets. Her research had been impressively thorough, covering every domestic account, investment, and piece of property we'd acquired together. But she'd made one crucial oversight. The offshore account I'd established 15 years ago had never appeared on any tax return or financial statement she'd seen. Originally created as a hedge against economic instability, that Cayman Islands account had grown steadily through careful currency trading and international investments. While she was cataloging our domestic assets, $2.8 million sat quietly in Georgetown, completely invisible to her investigation. The house felt like a museum when I walked through the front door, every room filled with memories that now felt contaminated by her betrayal. We'd bought the Bellevue property in 2003, a modest 3-bedroom home that we'd expanded and renovated over the years. Victoria had supervised every detail of the kitchen remodel, the master suite addition, the landscaping that had transformed a basic yard into something worthy of architectural magazines. Now, those same rooms felt hollow, their beauty overshadowed by the knowledge that they'd become weapons in her campaign to destroy me financially. I moved through spaces where we'd celebrated anniversaries, hosted Thanksgiving dinners, and made love with the passion of newlyweds. Every corner held evidence of a relationship I'd apparently misunderstood completely. In my home office, I pulled up the secure banking interface that connected me to my Cayman Islands account. The balance showed $2,847,362, accumulated over 15 years of careful international investments. The account had been my insurance policy against the economic volatility that periodically devastated the construction industry. I'd never mentioned it to Victoria, not because I wanted to hide money from her, but because I'd planned to surprise her with early retirement funded by offshore investments. That surprise would have to wait. Now the account represented something far more important than retirement planning. It was my lifeline to financial independence and the foundation for rebuilding everything she was trying to take away. The phone rang at 9:30 that evening, interrupting my review of offshore banking regulations. Victoria's voice carried a tone of barely contained satisfaction when I answered. I hope you had time to think about our meeting today, she said without preamble. Richard believes we can finalize everything within 60 days if you're cooperative. Cooperative meaning I accept financial destruction without complaint. Cooperative meaning you accept responsibility for your choices. 22 years, Marcus. 22 years of putting business before marriage. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be devastating. I had prioritized the business, working 70-hour weeks during expansion phases, missing anniversaries when major projects demanded attention, postponing vacations when client emergencies arose. But I'd believed we were building something together, creating financial security that would allow us to enjoy our later years without economic stress. I thought we were partners, I said quietly. I thought you understood what I was trying to accomplish. Partners don't ignore their wives for decades while accumulating wealth. You treated me like a piece of furniture, Marcus, beautiful, expensive, but ultimately just decoration for your successful life. The line went quiet for several moments, filled with the weight of 22 years' worth of accumulated resentment. When she spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, revealing a glimpse of vulnerability beneath the corporate hostility. I loved you once, I really did, but you made me feel invisible, like my only value was looking good at company parties and keeping your house running smoothly. I deserve better than that. After she hung up, I sat in the dark kitchen, staring out at the garden she'd designed and planted with such enthusiasm during our early years together. The conversation had revealed the emotional foundation beneath her financial warfare. This wasn't just about money. It was about 22 years of feeling undervalued and overlooked. The tragedy was that she wasn't entirely wrong. I had become obsessed with business success, convinced that financial security would solve all our problems. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped seeing Victoria as a partner and started treating her as a beautiful accessory to my entrepreneurial achievements. Her transformation from idealistic architect to bitter adversary hadn't happened overnight. It had been years in the making, with warning signs I'd been too busy to recognize. But understanding her motivations didn't change the present reality. She was determined to destroy me financially, using the legal system to claim assets she hadn't earned and hadn't contributed to creating. My sympathy for her emotional journey didn't extend to accepting financial annihilation. The next morning brought a call from Jennifer Walsh with an update on Victoria's legal strategy. Richard Harrison had filed additional motions seeking temporary spousal support, exclusive use of the family home, and immediate access to all business accounts. They were moving aggressively, trying to establish possession before the final settlement could be negotiated. She's playing hardball, Jennifer explained over the phone. Harrison specializes in scorched earth tactics. He's probably advised her to make your life as difficult as possible to force a quick settlement on her terms. How long can this drag on? If they want to be vindictive, 18 months, maybe longer. Harrison has been known to tie up cases for years when it serves his clients' interests. The longer it takes, the more expensive it becomes for you to fight. After hanging up, I realized that Victoria's strategy was even more sophisticated than I'd initially understood. She wasn't just claiming our assets, she was trying to bleed me dry through legal fees and temporary support payments. Every month of delay would cost me thousands in attorney fees, while she lived comfortably in our house, supported by court-ordered payments from my business income. It was time to visit the Cayman Islands. The flight from Seattle to Georgetown took 8 hours, with a connection in Miami, giving me plenty of time to plan my next moves. I told Victoria and Jennifer that I was visiting potential clients in Vancouver for a few days, a plausible cover story that would explain my absence without raising suspicions about international travel. Georgetown felt like stepping into a different world where banking privacy laws and international finance created opportunities that simply didn't exist in the United States. The city's financial district buzzed with the quiet efficiency of serious money, discrete office buildings housing the kind of wealth that preferred to remain invisible. My meeting at Cayman International Bank took place in a conference room that could have belonged to any major financial institution, except for the view of 7 Mile Beach visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. Patricia Morrison, the account manager who'd overseen my investments for the past 15 years, greeted me with the professional warmth of someone who understood the value of discretion. "Mr. Chen, it's wonderful to see you again. I trust your flight was comfortable?" Patricia was a British expatriate who'd built her career managing offshore accounts for American entrepreneurs seeking international diversification. She understood the complex regulatory environment that governed cross-border banking and had structured my account to remain completely compliant with U.S. tax laws while maintaining absolute privacy. "I need to discuss some changes to the account structure," I explained, settling into the leather chair across from her desk. "My domestic situation has become complicated." "Divorce proceedings?" Her expression remained neutral, but I could see the understanding in her eyes. She'd probably helped dozens of clients navigate similar situations. "My wife has filed for divorce and is seeking 60% of all marital assets. She's been quite thorough in documenting our domestic finances, but she has no knowledge of this account." Patricia nodded thoughtfully, pulling up my account information on her computer. "The good news is that your account predates your wife's financial investigation, and all deposits were made from pre-tax business income that was properly reported to the IRS. From a legal standpoint, this represents legitimate international investment activity." "Can she claim it in the divorce settlement?" "Theoretically, yes, if she can prove it exists and demonstrate that it constitutes marital property. However, discovery of offshore accounts requires specific knowledge of their existence and location. Without that knowledge, they remain effectively invisible to domestic legal proceedings." The implications were clear. As long as Victoria remained unaware of the account's existence, it would be excluded from our asset division. I could emerge from the divorce proceedings apparently devastated while actually retaining access to nearly $3 million in offshore investments. "I want to restructure everything for maximum privacy," I told Patricia, "and I may need to access funds during the next few months." We spent the next 3 hours reviewing account options and investment strategies. Patricia recommended converting the existing account into an international LLC structure, which would provide additional privacy layers while maintaining full legal compliance. The process would take several weeks to complete, but once finished, the account would become virtually untraceable through conventional legal discovery methods. The flight back to Seattle felt like traveling between two different realities. In the Cayman Islands, I was a sophisticated international investor with nearly $3 million at my disposal. In Washington state, I was about to become a divorced man facing financial ruin. The contrast was surreal, but also strangely liberating. Victoria was waiting in the kitchen when I returned from my supposed Vancouver business trip, her expression suggesting she had news to share. She'd clearly been preparing for this conversation, with legal documents spread across the breakfast table and her laptop open to what looked like financial spreadsheets. "How was your trip?" she asked, with false casualness. "Productive. Secured a contract for a mixed-use development project." "That's convenient timing, considering our current situation." Her tone carried a note of suspicion that made me wonder if she somehow knew about my actual destination. "Richard thinks you might be trying to hide assets before the final settlement." The accusation was ironic, given that I was sitting on nearly $3 million she'd never find. But her paranoia was also troubling, suggesting that Harrison had advised her to watch for signs of financial concealment. "I'm focused on keeping the business operational during this transition," I replied carefully. "New contracts mean job security for my employees." "How noble of you to worry about your employees while trying to cheat your wife out of her fair share." Victoria's hostility had intensified during my absence, probably fueled by additional strategy sessions with her attorney. She was now viewing every conversation through the lens of legal warfare, analyzing my words for hidden meanings and financial deception. "I'm not trying to cheat anyone," I said, which was technically true. The offshore account had been established long before our marriage deteriorated, and I'd never hidden its existence with malicious intent. "I'm trying to survive a divorce that seems designed to destroy me financially." "You should have thought about financial consequences before ignoring your wife for 20 years." The conversation was becoming circular, with both of us retreating into defensive positions that made meaningful communication impossible. Victoria had convinced herself that I was the villain in our marriage's collapse, while I struggled to understand how we'd reached a point where she viewed my complete destruction as appropriate justice. That night, lying alone in the guest bedroom I'd occupied since our separation began, I reflected on the strange duality of my situation. Victoria believed she was orchestrating my downfall with surgical precision, methodically claiming every asset I'd accumulated during our marriage. She had no idea that her perfect revenge contained a massive blind spot that would ultimately protect my financial future. The offshore account represented more than just hidden money. It was proof that I'd been thinking about our long-term security while she was cataloging grievances and planning my destruction. In 15 years of international investing, I'd never considered the possibility that those funds might become my lifeline during a vindictive divorce. Now, they represented the difference between starting over with nothing and rebuilding from a position of hidden strength. Over the next several weeks, Victoria's legal campaign intensified with the methodical precision of a military operation. Harrison filed motion after motion, seeking temporary exclusive use of our house, increased spousal support, and detailed financial discovery that would have exposed every domestic account I'd ever opened. The legal fees were mounting rapidly, just as Jennifer had predicted, creating financial pressure designed to force a settlement on Victoria's terms. Meanwhile, Patricia Morrison worked quietly in the Cayman Islands to restructure my offshore holdings into an international LLC that would be virtually impossible to trace through conventional legal channels. The new structure included multiple layers of privacy protection, with the actual account ownership buried beneath legitimate business entities that existed only on paper. Victoria seemed to sense that something had changed in my demeanor, though she couldn't identify what was different. I'd stopped arguing about her settlement demands, accepting each new financial blow with the resignation of someone who'd given up fighting. From her perspective, I was finally accepting the reality of my situation and preparing to surrender. She had no idea that my apparent defeat was actually careful preparation for a revelation that would shatter her world as completely as she'd tried to shatter mine. The offshore account wasn't just my escape plan, it was about to become the foundation for the most satisfying conversation of my life. 3 months after receiving those initial divorce papers, I sat in my soon-to-be former home office, reviewing the final settlement documents that would officially end our marriage. Victoria had gotten everything she'd demanded: the house, 60% of the business, our domestic savings accounts, even my beloved classic car collection. On paper, I was about to become a man with assets totaling less than $200,000. In reality, I was about to become invisibly wealthy, with access to offshore investments that would allow me to rebuild everything she'd taken and more. Tomorrow, we would sign the final papers at Harrison's office, and she would celebrate her victory while remaining completely unaware of how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. Justice, I reflected, sometimes required patience and the ability to see beyond immediate defeat to ultimate victory. Victoria had taught me valuable lessons about the price of neglecting a marriage, but she was about to learn something equally important about the dangers of underestimating your opponent. The final conversation was going to be unforgettable. The signing ceremony took place on a gray Thursday morning in November, Seattle's perpetual drizzle creating the perfect atmosphere for what Victoria believed would be my financial funeral. Harrison's conference room had been transformed into a document processing center, with stacks of papers requiring signatures, notarizations, and official stamps that would legally transfer 22 years of accumulated wealth into Victoria's possession. She arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her platinum hair was pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, and she carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who'd just won the lottery. Richard Harrison flanked her like a bodyguard, his silver hair perfectly styled and his handmade suit radiating the kind of expensive authority that had made him Seattle's most feared divorce attorney. Marcus, Victoria's greeting was coolly professional, as if we were strangers conducting a routine business transaction rather than former spouses dissolving a marriage. "I trust you've had time to review all the settlement documents." "Thoroughly," I replied, taking my seat across from her at the mahogany table. Jennifer Walsh had arrived moments before me, carrying a briefcase full of our own paperwork and wearing the grim expression of someone attending an execution. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of legal formalities and signature ceremonies. Document after document crossed the table, each one transferring another piece of my life's work into Victoria's control. The house deed, business partnership agreements, investment account authorizations, vehicle titles, everything I'd accumulated during our marriage was systematically redistributed according to the settlement terms she'd negotiated. Harrison read each transfer aloud with the solemnity of a funeral director, ensuring that every detail was properly documented and legally binding. Transfer of primary residence located at 1247 Bellevue Avenue to Victoria Chen, effective immediately upon final decree. The house where we'd hosted dinner parties, celebrated holidays, and planned our future now belonged exclusively to her. Assignment of 60% ownership interest in Chen Construction LLC to Victoria Chen with associated voting rights and profit distributions. 20 years of building a company from nothing reduced to a legal paragraph that would make her the majority owner of my life's work. Transfer of Morgan Stanley investment portfolio, account number ending in 7834, total value $847,000. Our retirement savings, accumulated through decades of careful investment and compound growth, now belong to someone who viewed me as an enemy to be financially destroyed. With each signature, Victoria's satisfaction became more obvious. She wasn't just claiming assets, she was savoring my apparent defeat, watching me sign away everything I'd worked to create. Her eyes held the cold triumph of someone who believed they'd achieved perfect revenge against a husband who'd neglected them for 2 decades. What she didn't know was that every signature I placed on those documents brought me closer to the most satisfying revelation of my life. While she was claiming 60% of our documented assets, I retained access to offshore investments worth more than everything she was taking combined. Her perfect revenge contained a massive blind spot that would soon become her worst nightmare. The final document was a general release, absolving both parties of any future financial claims against each other. Victoria signed it with a flourish, her handwriting bold and confident. She was closing the door on our marriage and opening a new chapter as a wealthy divorcee who'd successfully punished her neglectful ex-husband. "Congratulations, Mrs. Chen," Harrison said, gathering the completed paperwork into neat stacks. "This settlement provides excellent financial security for your future independence." Victoria's smile was radiant with satisfaction. "Thank you, Richard. Your expertise made all the difference in achieving a fair resolution." Fair. The word hung in the air like poison gas. Nothing about this process had been fair, but Washington state's community property laws had given her the legal framework to claim assets she'd never earned while portraying herself as the victim of an uncaring spouse. The irony was that she was about to discover just how unfair her supposedly perfect victory actually was. "Marcus," she addressed me directly for the first time since we'd begun signing papers, "I hope this experience has taught you something valuable about treating people with respect. Maybe your next wife will benefit from the lessons you've learned." The condescension in her voice was breathtaking. She was lecturing me about respect while systematically looting everything I'd built during our marriage. But I managed to maintain my mask of defeated resignation, knowing that her smugness would make the coming revelation even more devastating. "I'm sure I'll remember this day for a long time," I replied, which was absolutely true, though not in the way she imagined. After the paperwork was complete, Victoria and Harrison lingered in the conference room, discussing her immediate plans for the newly acquired assets. She wanted to put the house on the market within 30 days, liquidate the classic car collection through high-end auction houses, and restructure the business operations to maximize her profit distributions. Every conversation topic involved monetizing or disposing of things that had once held sentimental value. The 1967 Mustang should bring at least $60,000 at Barrett-Jackson, Harrison was saying, consulting notes on his legal pad. The Porsche collection might be worth even more to the right collector. Victoria nodded enthusiastically, her eyes bright with anticipation. I want everything converted to liquid assets as quickly as possible. I'm planning to travel extensively, maybe buy a condo in Manhattan or San Francisco.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It's time to start living the life I've always deserved. Listening to them discuss liquidating my car collection felt like overhearing strangers plan to butcher beloved pets. Those vehicles represented years of patient restoration work, weekends spent in the garage rebuilding engines and refinishing chrome. The 1967 Mustang had been my first classic purchase, bought as a rust bucket and transformed into concourse condition through months of careful craftsmanship. Now it would be sold to fund Victoria's post-divorce shopping spree. I excused myself from their asset liquidation planning session and walked to the parking garage, where my modest Honda Civic waited in the space designated for visitors. The contrast between my current transportation and the collection of classics Victoria was planning to auction highlighted the apparent completeness of her victory. She'd reduced me from successful businessman to near poverty, or so she believed. The drive home to my temporary apartment took 30 minutes through Seattle traffic, giving me time to process the morning's events. I'd just signed away the visible evidence of 22 years' worth of success, but I felt strangely liberated rather than devastated. Every signature had been a step closer to freedom from Victoria's toxic presence and closer to revealing the offshore account that would restore my financial independence. My new living situation was a furnished one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, a far cry from our Bellevue mansion, but adequate for someone planning to rebuild from a position of hidden strength. The building was modern and anonymous, exactly what I needed, while Victoria believed she was monitoring my every financial move through her network of legal surveillance. That evening, I called Patricia Morrison in the Cayman Islands to confirm that the LLC restructuring had been completed. The offshore account was now completely invisible to domestic legal discovery, protected by multiple layers of international privacy laws that would make it virtually impossible to trace even if someone suspected its existence. The new structure is operational, Patricia confirmed over the secure phone line. Your investment portfolio has been transferred to Chen International Holdings, LLC, a Cayman Islands entity with no visible connection to your personal name. The account balance currently stands at $2,891,445 after recent currency fluctuations. Nearly $3 million sitting quietly in the Caribbean, while Victoria celebrated claiming assets worth less than $2 million total. Her perfect revenge had netted her a smaller fortune than the money she didn't know existed. The irony was delicious. I may need to begin accessing funds within the next few weeks, I told Patricia. I'm planning some significant business investments. No problem whatsoever. The LLC structure allows for immediate wire transfers to any domestic account you designate. Would you like me to establish a new U.S. banking relationship to receive the funds? Within 24 hours, I had a new business account at First National Bank of Washington, seeded with an initial transfer of $50,000 from my Cayman Islands LLC. The account was opened under the name Chen Holdings USA, a domestic entity I'd established to receive international investment distributions. To outside observers, it would appear that I was starting a small consulting business with modest capital. Victoria spent the following week inventorying our former marital assets with the methodical precision of a professional appraiser. She hired specialists to evaluate the classic car collection, brought in real estate agents to assess the house's market value, and met with business consultants to optimize her majority ownership of Chen Construction. Every asset was being analyzed for maximum liquidation value. Her thoroughness was impressive and completely pointless. While she was cataloging the spoils of her legal victory, I was quietly rebuilding my financial foundation with money she'd never find. The offshore account gave me resources to start over without depending on anything she'd claimed in the divorce settlement. I rented office space in a modest building near Pioneer Square, establishing the Seattle headquarters for Chen Holdings USA. The suite consisted of 2 rooms and a reception area. Professional, but understated, exactly right for someone supposedly starting over with limited resources. Victoria would expect me to struggle financially. This office would reinforce that perception while providing legitimate cover for my offshore investment activities. The first major purchase was a small construction company in Spokane, a family business whose elderly owner wanted to retire but couldn't find a buyer willing to maintain his employees and existing contracts. I acquired the company through Chen Holdings USA for $380,000, paying cash from my Cayman Islands account. To outside observers, the purchase would seem like a modest investment by someone slowly rebuilding their business presence. In reality, it was the foundation for a construction empire that would eventually dwarf everything Victoria had claimed in our divorce. The Spokane company employed 12 people and generated annual revenues of approximately $2 million. With proper management and strategic expansion, it could become the cornerstone of a much larger operation. Victoria remained completely unaware of these developments. Her focus was entirely on liquidating marital assets and enjoying her newfound wealth. She'd moved into a luxury apartment downtown while preparing the Bellevue house for sale, and her social media posts showed her shopping in expensive boutiques and dining at Seattle's most exclusive restaurants. She was living the lifestyle of someone who just inherited a fortune, which was essentially accurate. 3 weeks after our divorce was finalized, she called me unexpectedly on a Friday evening. Her voice carried a tone of casual cruelty that suggested she was calling to gloat rather than discuss any legitimate business. "Marcus, I hope you're adjusting well to your new circumstances," she began with false concern. "I know this transition must be difficult for someone who's always defined himself through material success." "I'm managing," I replied carefully, unsure where the conversation was heading. "I wanted you to know that I've accepted an offer on the house, full asking price, cash buyer, closing in 2 weeks. The buyers love what we did with the kitchen renovation." The kitchen renovation we'd planned together during happier times, when we'd believed we were building something permanent rather than creating assets for future legal warfare. Victoria's casual reference to "we" was particularly galling, given that she'd systematically erased me from every other aspect of our shared history. "I'm sure you'll be happy with the proceeds," I said. "Very happy. Combined with the car auction and business income, I'm looking at a quite comfortable future, more comfortable than I ever imagined when we were married." The implication was clear. She was better off without me, financially and emotionally. Her divorce victory had provided resources for a lifestyle that exceeded anything we'd enjoyed together. She'd transformed the end of our marriage into the beginning of her best life. "I'm glad you're satisfied with the outcome," I replied, which was true for reasons she couldn't imagine. "Satisfied? Marcus, I'm thriving. For the first time in 20 years, I feel like I'm living instead of just existing as an accessory to someone else's ambitions." After she hung up, I sat in my modest apartment, staring out at the Seattle skyline and reflecting on the conversation's implications. Victoria genuinely believed she'd achieved perfect justice, punishing my neglect while securing her financial independence. She had no idea that her perfect revenge was about to become her worst nightmare. The Spokane acquisition was progressing smoothly, with the previous owner providing detailed transition assistance and employee introductions. The company's books were cleaner than I'd expected, and their existing contracts provided steady revenue streams that would support immediate expansion plans. Within 6 months, I projected being able to acquire additional companies and begin serious competition with my former business in Seattle. Victoria's celebrations continued through November and into December. Her social media presence had exploded with photos of expensive vacations, designer purchases, and exclusive events. She was documenting her post-divorce renaissance with the enthusiasm of someone who'd escaped prison, though her captions occasionally included subtle references to finally being free from toxic relationships and discovering what genuine happiness feels like. The not-so-subtle digs were amusing rather than hurtful. She was trying to construct a narrative where she was the hero of our divorce story, the brave woman who'd escaped an oppressive marriage and claimed her rightful compensation. The truth was more complex, but her version made for better social media content. Christmas morning arrived with unusual significance. For the first time in 22 years, I was spending the holiday alone. But instead of feeling depressed, I felt oddly liberated. Victoria had always insisted on elaborate celebrations with her family, formal dinners that required days of preparation and hours of playing the role of successful couple. This year, I had coffee in my quiet apartment and reviewed business plans for the coming year. The solitude was peaceful rather than lonely. I was free to think clearly about the future without Victoria's constant emotional manipulation and social obligations. The offshore account gave me resources to rebuild everything she'd taken, but more importantly, it provided the freedom to create something entirely new. By New Year's Eve, Chen Holdings USA had acquired 2 additional small construction companies, one in Tacoma and another in Everett. The combined operations employed 38 people and generated annual revenues approaching $7 million. None of these acquisitions appeared in any public records that Victoria might monitor, and the modest office space in Pioneer Square gave no indication of the growing business empire it actually housed. Victoria spent New Year's Eve at a charity gala in downtown Seattle, judging from her Instagram posts. She wore a designer gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and posed with other wealthy divorcees who'd attended similar events. Her smile was radiant with satisfaction, the expression of someone who'd achieved everything they'd ever wanted. She had no idea that across town, her supposedly devastated ex-husband was quietly building an empire that would soon make her divorce settlement look like pocket change. The offshore account that had funded these acquisitions remained completely invisible to her ongoing financial surveillance, hidden behind layers of international privacy laws that protected legitimate business investments. January brought an unexpected development when Victoria's attorney called Jennifer Walsh with a strange request. Harrison wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss post-divorced asset clarification, though he refused to elaborate on what required clarification. The request was unusual enough that Jennifer advised caution. Harrison doesn't typically follow up on completed settlements unless there's a specific issue, she explained during our phone conversation. He might suspect you have undisclosed assets, or Victoria might have discovered something that concerns her. The possibility that Victoria had somehow learned about the offshore account was troubling, though I couldn't imagine how she might have uncovered information that had remained hidden throughout her exhaustive financial investigation. The Cayman Islands account had never appeared on any document she'd seen, and my recent business activities were conducted through domestic entities with no obvious connection to international banking. "Schedule the meeting," I told Jennifer. "Let's find out what they want." The meeting was set for the following Thursday at Harrison's office, the same conference room where I'd signed away my apparent financial future just 10 weeks earlier. This time, Victoria arrived with a different energy, less triumphant and more suspicious. She'd traded her designer suit for a more conservative outfit, and her expression suggested someone preparing for combat rather than celebration. "Thank you both for coming," Harrison began, his tone carrying none of the satisfied authority I remembered from our divorce proceedings. "My client has some concerns about potential asset concealment that we'd like to address directly." Jennifer leaned forward slightly, her expression professionally neutral. "What specific concerns?" The settlement was comprehensive, and my client disclosed all required financial information. Victoria spoke for the first time since we'd sat down, her voice tight with barely controlled suspicion. "I've been monitoring Marcus's activities since our divorce was finalized. He's been remarkably active for someone who supposedly lost everything." My heart rate increased slightly, but I maintained my expression of confused innocence. "I'm not sure what you mean by remarkably active. I've been trying to rebuild my career." "You've been acquiring companies, Marcus, multiple companies. Where exactly are you getting the capital for these purchases?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria had clearly been conducting surveillance on my business activities, probably through private investigators or public record searches. The domestic acquisitions I'd made through Chen Holdings USA were matters of public record, visible to anyone who knew where to look. "I've been consulting for investors who are backing my expansion plans," I replied, which was technically accurate. The Cayman Islands LLC was indeed an investor backing my expansion, though Victoria didn't need to know that I was the sole beneficiary of that investment vehicle. Harrison pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be corporate filings and property records. Chen Holdings USA has acquired 3 construction companies in the past 2 months, paying cash for transactions totaling over $1 million. That's quite impressive for someone whose documented net worth is less than $200,000. Jennifer interrupted before I could respond. "My client's post-divorce business activities are not subject to discovery unless you're alleging fraud in the original settlement. Are you making such an allegation?" "We're asking legitimate questions about the source of funds for these acquisitions," Harrison replied smoothly.
If Mr. Chen had access to investment capital during our divorce proceedings, that information should have been disclosed. The meeting was becoming dangerous. Victoria's post-divorce surveillance had uncovered enough information to raise legitimate questions about my apparent financial recovery. If they pushed hard enough, they might eventually trace the domestic acquisitions back to their offshore funding source. "The investment arrangements were established after our divorce was finalized," I said carefully. "Private investors who were impressed by my track record offered backing for a new venture." Victoria's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What investors? I want names, Marcus. I want documentation." "That information is confidential under the terms of our investment agreements." "How convenient." Her voice carried the acid tone I remembered from our worst marital arguments. "Mysterious investors with unlimited cash who conveniently appeared right after you supposedly lost everything in our divorce." The conversation was spiraling toward dangerous territory. Victoria's suspicions were well-founded, even if she couldn't prove them, and Harrison was experienced enough to recognize the signs of asset concealment. I needed to end this meeting before they demanded financial records that might reveal the offshore connection. "If you have specific allegations of misconduct, please present them formally through proper legal channels," Jennifer said, gathering her papers with the efficiency of someone preparing to leave. "Otherwise, this appears to be a fishing expedition based on speculation rather than evidence." Victoria's frustration was obvious as we prepared to leave the conference room. She'd clearly hoped this confrontation would expose whatever deception she suspected, but without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, her accusations remained just paranoid speculation. "This isn't over, Marcus," she said as we reached the elevator. "I know you're hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is." "Good luck with that," I replied, which was probably more confident than wise under the circumstances. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was silent, but I could feel Victoria's suspicious stare boring into me like a laser. She knew something was wrong with my apparent financial recovery, but she couldn't identify what or how to prove it. Her frustration was palpable and strangely satisfying. That evening, I called Patricia Morrison to discuss additional security measures for the offshore account. Victoria's unexpected surveillance capabilities meant I needed to be more careful about maintaining the separation between my domestic business activities and their international funding source. "We can establish additional privacy layers if you're concerned about discovery," Patricia explained. "Multiple shell companies, nominee directors, even physical relocation of account management to other jurisdictions. The goal is making the trail so complex that casual investigation becomes practically impossible." "Do whatever's necessary." Victoria is more persistent than I expected. "Most angry ex-spouses lose interest after a few months when they don't find anything obvious. The key is avoiding any direct connections between your offshore assets and domestic activities." Over the following weeks, I became more cautious about business expansion, spacing out acquisitions and using different funding mechanisms to obscure their common source. Victoria's surveillance was a complication I hadn't anticipated, but it also indicated how desperately she wanted to prove that her perfect divorce victory was somehow illegitimate. The irony was that she was absolutely correct. Her perfect revenge had failed completely, leaving me with access to resources that would soon dwarf everything she'd claimed in our settlement. But proving that fact would require investigative capabilities far beyond what she could afford, even with her newfound divorce wealth. Spring brought another unexpected development when Victoria hired a private investigator named David Kellerman, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial forensics. Jennifer learned about this development through professional contacts in Seattle's legal community, and the news was concerning enough to warrant another strategy session. Kellerman has a reputation for finding hidden assets, Jennifer explained during our meeting at her law office. He's expensive, but he's helped several attorneys recover money that seemed untraceable. If Victoria is serious about exposing your business activities, he might be the person who could actually do it. The threat was real enough to require immediate countermeasures. I contacted Patricia Morrison and requested the most sophisticated privacy protection available, regardless of cost. Within a week, the Cayman Islands account had been restructured through a network of shell companies spanning 3 different countries, with nominee directors and encrypted communication systems that would frustrate even professional investigators. Meanwhile, Victoria's public celebration of her divorce victory was beginning to show cracks. Her social media posts had become less frequent and more defensive, with captions that suggested she was responding to criticism or doubt from her social circle. The euphoria of claiming my assets was being replaced by growing suspicion that her victory might be incomplete. By summer, the situation had escalated into a full-scale investigation that was costing Victoria thousands of dollars monthly in private investigator fees. Kellerman was thorough and professional, documenting every aspect of my post-divorce business activities and searching for connections to undisclosed assets. His reports were probably quite detailed, but they couldn't penetrate the international privacy laws protecting my offshore investments. The investigation was becoming expensive enough to affect Victoria's lifestyle. Her posts about expensive vacations and designer purchases had virtually stopped, replaced by subtle complaints about dealing with dishonest people and the cost of seeking justice. She was spending her divorce settlement trying to prove that she deserved an even larger divorce settlement. Meanwhile, Chen Holdings USA had grown into a significant regional construction company, with operations in 5 cities and annual revenues approaching $15 million. The growth had been funded entirely through offshore investments that remained invisible to domestic investigation, creating the appearance of miraculous business success without obvious financing sources. Victoria's investigation was actually helping me in unexpected ways. Kellerman's reports documented my business growth without uncovering its funding source, creating a paper trail that would support my apparent transformation from divorced failure to successful entrepreneur. When the time came to reveal my true financial position, these investigative reports would provide independent verification of my business acumen. August brought a breaking point when Victoria's legal bills exceeded her remaining liquid assets. She'd spent nearly $200,000 trying to prove that I'd hidden money during our divorce, but Kellerman's investigation had produced nothing but documentation of legitimate business activities funded through mysterious but apparently legal sources. Harrison called Jennifer with a settlement offer that bordered on desperate. Victoria was willing to drop her investigation in exchange for a one-time payment of $200,000, no questions asked about where the money originated.
The offer revealed how badly her obsession with exposing my alleged deception had damaged her own financial position. "She's essentially offering to sell her suspicions," Jennifer explained during our phone conversation. "Pay her $200,000 and she'll agree to stop investigating your business activities." The offer was tempting because it would end Victoria's expensive surveillance and eliminate the risk that Kellerman might eventually discover something significant. But it would also validate her suspicions and suggest that I was indeed hiding substantial assets. More importantly, it would deprive me of the satisfaction of revealing the offshore account on my own terms. "Tell Harrison we're not interested," I decided. Victoria created this investigation based on paranoid speculation. She can live with the consequences of her choices. The rejection drove Victoria into a frenzy of escalated investigation that bordered on harassment. She hired additional private investigators, initiated civil litigation seeking forensic accounting of my business activities, and even contacted the IRS with allegations of tax evasion. Every accusation required expensive legal responses that further depleted her divorce settlement while accomplishing nothing productive. By autumn, Victoria's financial situation had deteriorated dramatically. The house sale proceeds and business income she'd claimed in our divorce had been largely consumed by legal fees and investigative costs. She'd essentially spent her settlement trying to prove she deserved a larger settlement, a self-defeating strategy that had left her worse off than if she'd simply enjoyed her original victory. Her social media presence had devolved into barely veiled accusations about corrupt ex-husbands and the difficulty of obtaining justice against wealthy criminals. The posts were becoming so paranoid and vindictive that her friends were beginning to distance themselves, probably embarrassed by her public deterioration. The final phase of Victoria's self-destruction began in November when she filed a civil lawsuit alleging fraud in our divorce proceedings. The complaint claimed that I'd hidden millions of dollars in assets and demanded complete forensic accounting of my post-divorce business activities. It was a desperate gambit by someone who'd exhausted her other options for proving suspicions she couldn't abandon. Jennifer reviewed the lawsuit with the clinical detachment of someone analyzing a particularly desperate legal strategy. She's essentially betting her remaining assets on the chance that a civil court will compel discovery that her private investigators couldn't achieve. It's a high-risk strategy that could leave her completely bankrupt if she loses. What are the chances she'll win? Minimal. She'd need to present evidence of actual fraud, not just suspicious business success. Kellerman's investigation documented legitimate activities funded through legal sources, even if those sources remain mysterious. Suspicion isn't evidence. The lawsuit would take months to resolve, giving me time to prepare for the moment when I would finally reveal the offshore account that had funded my entire post-divorce renaissance. Victoria was about to discover that her perfect revenge had been built on incomplete information and that her supposedly devastated ex-husband had been quietly assembling an empire that dwarfed everything she'd claimed in our settlement. The revelation would be worth waiting for. Justice delayed was about to become justice magnificently served. Victoria's civil lawsuit consumed the remainder of winter and most of spring, burning through her remaining assets with the efficiency of a financial furnace. She'd mortgaged the downtown apartment she'd purchased with divorce proceeds, sold jewelry and artwork, even liquidated retirement accounts to fund her increasingly desperate legal campaign. What had begun as a confident investigation into my alleged asset concealment had devolved into a ruinous obsession that was destroying her more thoroughly than our divorce ever could have. By May, her financial situation had become so precarious that Harrison was demanding payment in advance for continued legal representation. The attorney who'd orchestrated her supposedly perfect divorce victory was now treating her like a credit risk, requiring weekly retainer payments that strained her dwindling resources. The irony was obvious to everyone except Victoria herself. Meanwhile, Chen Holdings USA had expanded into Oregon and Northern California, acquiring regional construction companies that brought our total workforce to over 200 employees and annual revenues approaching $40 million. The growth trajectory was unprecedented in the industry, creating the kind of success story that attracted attention from business publications and industry analysts. Seattle Business Journal published a profile of my apparent comeback that read like a financial fairy tale. From divorce to dynasty, how Marcus Chen rebuilt an empire detailed my rise from devastating personal loss to entrepreneurial triumph, though the article necessarily glossed over the funding sources that had made such rapid expansion possible. I was portrayed as a business genius who'd leveraged mysterious investor relationships to create extraordinary success. Victoria read the article obsessively, according to Jennifer, who'd heard from courthouse contacts that she'd been seen photocopying it multiple times and annotating passages with increasingly frantic handwriting.
The public celebration of my business achievements was driving her deeper into paranoid desperation, confirming her belief that I'd somehow cheated her out of millions of dollars while making her look foolish for pursuing obviously frivolous litigation. The breakthrough she'd been seeking came from an unexpected source in June. David Kellerman had exhausted his conventional investigative methods without uncovering evidence of hidden assets, but he'd developed a theory about international banking that proved remarkably prescient. His final report to Victoria suggested that my rapid business expansion could only be explained by offshore funding sources, though he admitted lacking evidence to support such speculation. Victoria seized on this theory with the desperation of someone drowning who'd spotted a potential lifeline. She demanded that Kellerman expand his investigation to include international banking relationships, despite lacking legal authority to compel disclosure of foreign accounts. The request was legally pointless, but emotionally necessary for someone who'd staked her remaining credibility on exposing my alleged deception. Harrison tried to dissuade her from this final expensive gambit, pointing out that domestic courts had limited jurisdiction over offshore banking relationships and that international privacy laws would protect legitimate foreign investments. But Victoria had passed the point where rational legal advice could penetrate her obsessive determination to prove that her divorce victory had been incomplete. She hired a second investigative firm that specialized in international financial forensics, paying their $50,000 retainer with money borrowed against her remaining assets. The firm, Walsh Associates, had experience tracing offshore accounts for federal agencies and high-stakes civil litigation, though their success rate in purely domestic cases was significantly lower than their marketing materials suggested. I learned about this escalation through Jennifer, whose contacts in Seattle's legal community had become fascinated by Victoria's self-destructive litigation strategy. Her case was becoming something of a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting divorce resentment drive expensive legal decisions, though Victoria remained convinced that vindication was just one more investigation away. The timing was perfect for what I'd been planning since our divorce proceedings began. Victoria's financial desperation and public deterioration had created the ideal conditions for revealing the offshore account that had funded my entire post-divorce renaissance. Her obsessive investigation would make the revelation even more devastating, transforming her righteous quest for justice into public humiliation. I scheduled a meeting with Patricia Morrison in the Cayman Islands to discuss repatriating a substantial portion of my offshore investments. The account balance had grown to over $3 million through careful currency trading and international investment strategies, providing more than enough capital to fund the dramatic revelation I was planning. The flight to Georgetown felt different this time, less like escaping to financial sanctuary and more like preparing for the final phase of a carefully orchestrated campaign. Victoria had spent over a year trying to prove that my business success was built on hidden assets, and she was about to discover that her suspicions had dramatically underestimated the actual scope of what I'd concealed. Patricia greeted me with the professional warmth of someone who'd helped orchestrate one of the most sophisticated asset protection strategies she'd ever managed. The offshore account had grown beyond my original expectations, benefiting from international market conditions and currency fluctuations that had amplified returns on my carefully diversified investments. "You've built something quite impressive," she said, reviewing the account statement spread across her conference table. "The LLC structure has provided excellent privacy protection while generating substantial returns."
Your total portfolio value has exceeded $3.2 million. The growth was gratifying, but the real satisfaction would come from revealing these resources to Victoria at the moment when her financial destruction was most complete. She'd spent her divorce settlement trying to prove that I'd hidden money from her, and she was about to learn that her estimates had been laughably conservative. "I want to bring $2 million back to the United States," I told Patricia, "structured as legitimate business investment from my Cayman Islands LLC. Full tax compliance, proper documentation, completely above board." The repatriation process would take several weeks to complete, involving currency conversion, international wire transfers, and extensive documentation to satisfy U.S. banking regulations. But once finished, I would have immediate access to resources that would dwarf everything Victoria had claimed in our divorce settlement. Patricia handled the arrangements with her usual efficiency, coordinating with domestic banking partners and international compliance specialists to ensure that every aspect of the transfer met regulatory requirements. The goal was creating an unassailable paper trail that would demonstrate the legitimacy of my offshore investments while highlighting the futility of Victoria's expensive investigation. The return flight to Seattle felt like traveling toward a long-delayed reckoning. Victoria's civil lawsuit was scheduled for trial in August, giving me perfect timing to reveal the offshore account just as her final legal gambit reached its climax. She would discover that her year-long investigation had been doomed from the start based on incomplete information that had led her to destroy herself financially while chasing shadows. Back in Seattle, I met with Jennifer to discuss trial strategy for Victoria's civil lawsuit. The case was weak enough that summary judgment remained possible, but I wanted the trial to proceed so that Victoria's humiliation would be as public and complete as possible. She'd accused me of fraud in open court. I wanted to answer those accusations with evidence that would expose her own delusional thinking. The international transfer will create some interesting questions, Jennifer observed, reviewing Patricia's documentation. Victoria's attorneys will want to know why you're suddenly accessing offshore accounts if you've had them all along. Because I'm finally ready to stop hiding from her harassment, I replied. The account was established for legitimate business purposes long before our marriage deteriorated. I've maintained privacy to protect my business relationships from her vindictive litigation, but I'm prepared to disclose everything now that her accusations have become public. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. By voluntarily disclosing the offshore account during trial, I would demonstrate transparency while highlighting the futility of Victoria's expensive investigation. She'd spent over a year and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to uncover information I could have provided at any time if she'd approached the situation with good faith rather than vindictive paranoia. July brought the international wire transfer that would fund my trial revelation. $2 million moved from the Cayman Islands to my domestic business account, creating the kind of sudden liquidity that would be impossible to explain through conventional business success. The transfer was perfectly legal and properly documented, but its timing would be devastating to Victoria's remaining credibility. Victoria's financial situation had deteriorated to the point where she was representing herself in the final phases of her civil lawsuit, unable to afford continued legal representation from Harrison or any other competent attorney. Her pro se filings were increasingly erratic and emotional, filled with accusations that bordered on paranoid delusion and legal arguments that demonstrated her fundamental misunderstanding of civil procedure. The transformation was remarkable and tragic. The confident woman who'd orchestrated my apparent financial destruction 18 months earlier had been reduced to a desperate pro se litigant whose legal arguments were becoming the subject of courthouse gossip. Her obsession with proving my alleged deception had consumed her more thoroughly than our divorce ever could have. Trial began on a humid Monday morning in August, with Victoria arriving at King County Superior Court carrying boxes of documents and wearing an expression of grim determination. She'd obviously spent weeks preparing for this moment, believing that public testimony would finally expose the financial fraud she'd been alleging for over a year. Judge Patricia Coleman presided over proceedings with the patient efficiency of someone accustomed to handling desperate civil litigation. She'd reviewed the case file extensively and seemed skeptical about Victoria's chances of proving actual fraud, but she was prepared to let both sides present their evidence before ruling on the merits. Victoria's opening statement was a rambling narrative that combined legitimate grievances about our marriage with increasingly paranoid accusations about my post-divorce business activities. She claimed that my rapid success was impossible without hidden assets, that my mysterious investors were obviously fraudulent, and that the court had a duty to complete disclosure of my international financial relationships. "Your Honor," she concluded, her voice rising with emotional intensity, "Marcus Chen has committed massive fraud against this court and against me personally. He's hidden millions of dollars while claiming poverty during our divorce, and he's used those hidden assets to build a business empire that should rightfully belong to our marital estate." Jennifer's opening statement was a model of professional restraint that highlighted the speculative nature of Victoria's accusations. She pointed out that 18 months of expensive private investigation had produced no evidence of hidden assets, that my business success was documented through legitimate sources, and that Victoria's lawsuit was essentially asking the court to punish success based on nothing more than suspicious thinking. "Your Honor," Jennifer concluded, "Mrs. Chen has spent over a year and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to prove allegations that have no basis in fact. This lawsuit represents the final phase of a vindictive campaign that has destroyed her own financial security while accomplishing nothing productive." Victoria spent the next 2 days presenting her case with the desperate energy of someone whose credibility depended entirely on proving unprovable allegations. She called David Kellerman as a witness, though his testimony merely confirmed that his investigation had found no evidence of asset concealment. She introduced business records that documented my success without explaining its funding sources, apparently believing that mystery constituted evidence of fraud. Her cross-examination of my accountant was particularly painful to watch. She peppered him with increasingly frantic questions about offshore banking relationships and international investment strategies, obviously hoping he would accidentally reveal information that her private investigators had failed to uncover. But my accountant had handled the domestic aspects of my business operations and knew nothing about the Cayman Islands account that had funded everything. By Thursday morning, Victoria had exhausted her witness list without presenting any evidence that would support her fraud allegations. Her case consisted entirely of suspicious thinking and circumstantial observations that proved nothing beyond my unusual business success. She'd spent her remaining assets pursuing a lawsuit that was collapsing in real time. Jennifer's defense case took less than half a day to present. She called business partners who testified about my legitimate consulting relationships, accountants who confirmed the accuracy of my financial disclosures, and industry experts who explained that rapid business growth was possible with adequate investment capital. Every witness reinforced the same conclusion: my success was unusual but entirely legal. Then came the moment I'd been anticipating for 18 months. Jennifer called me as the final defense witness, and I took the stand prepared to deliver the revelation that would shatter Victoria's world as completely as she'd tried to shatter mine. "Mr. Chen," Jennifer began, her voice carrying the formal tone of courtroom examination, "Mrs. Chen has alleged that your post-divorce business success required hidden assets. Do you have any undisclosed financial resources that would explain your rapid expansion?" "Yes," I replied, looking directly at Victoria as her expression shifted from suspicion to shock. "I have maintained an offshore investment account in the Cayman Islands for approximately 15 years. The account currently holds over $1 million in international investments."
The courtroom fell silent except for Victoria's sharp intake of breath. She stared at me with an expression of pure amazement, probably calculating how long she'd spent trying to prove something I'd just admitted voluntarily. The vindication she'd been seeking had just been handed to her, but in a way that highlighted the pointlessness of her entire legal campaign. This account was established in 2009 for legitimate international investment purposes, I continued, maintaining eye contact with Victoria. I maintained privacy about its existence during our divorce proceedings because I believed it represented separate property acquired through premarital business activities. However, recent legal advice suggests that full disclosure is preferable to continued speculation. Judge Coleman leaned forward slightly, obviously interested in this unexpected development. "Mr. Chen, why didn't you disclose this account during your divorce proceedings if it existed at that time?" "Your Honor, the account was established using funds from my construction business, which I believed constituted separate property under Washington state law. I was advised that disclosure might complicate asset division unnecessarily, particularly since the funds were earmarked for retirement planning rather than current living expenses." Victoria shot to her feet, her voice cracking with emotion.
Your Honor, this proves everything I've been saying. He's admitted hiding millions of dollars during our divorce. I demand that the marital estate be reopened and that I receive my rightful share of these hidden assets. Jennifer stood to respond, her voice calm and professional. Your Honor, the account my client has disclosed contains approximately $1.2 million, not the millions alleged by Mrs. Chen. More importantly, he's volunteering this information precisely because her accusations have made continued privacy impossible. This demonstrates good faith, not fraud. Judge Coleman called for a brief recess to review the financial documentation that Patricia Morrison had prepared for this moment. The Cayman Islands banking records were extensive and professionally compiled, showing 15 years of careful investment activity that had grown my original deposits into substantial offshore holdings. When court reconvened, Victoria's demeanor had shifted from suspicious vindication to desperate confusion. She'd finally proven that I'd hidden assets during our divorce, but the revelation was coming too late to benefit her financially, and in a context that highlighted her own obsessive self-destruction. Mrs. Chen, Judge Coleman addressed Victoria directly, you've alleged that Mr. Chen concealed assets during your divorce proceedings. However, this civil lawsuit cannot retroactively modify a final divorce decree. Even if your allegations are proven, this court lacks jurisdiction to redistribute assets that were already subject to final settlement. The legal reality was devastating to Victoria's remaining hopes. She'd spent 18 months and her entire divorce settlement trying to prove asset concealment. And now that proof had been delivered voluntarily, in a context where it couldn't help her financially, and after she'd already destroyed herself pursuing proof of something I could have disclosed at any time. Victoria's reaction was a mixture of rage and despair that attracted sympathetic glances from court personnel who'd witnessed her self-destruction over the past several months. She'd spent everything chasing justice that turned out to be meaningless, leaving her worse off than if she'd simply enjoyed her original divorce settlement. After the court session ended, Victoria confronted me in the hallway outside Judge Coleman's courtroom. Her carefully maintained appearance had deteriorated noticeably, and her designer clothes looked rumpled and expensive compared to her obvious financial distress. "You bastard," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion. "You let me destroy myself for 18 months when you could have just told the truth from the beginning. You never asked for the truth, Victoria. You demanded proof of fraud. I gave you exactly what you were looking for. I lost everything because of you. The apartment, the investments, everything I got in our divorce settlement. I spent it all trying to prove you were lying, and now I have nothing left." The irony was complete and devastating. Victoria had achieved her goal of proving asset concealment, but the victory had cost her everything she'd gained from our divorce. She'd essentially paid millions of dollars to obtain information that had no practical value, leaving her worse off than if she'd never pursued the investigation. "You made a choice to pursue expensive litigation based on suspicious thinking rather than accepting a settlement that made you financially secure," I replied. "I never forced you to hire private investigators or file frivolous lawsuits." "Those were your decisions." Victoria's eyes filled with tears that mixed rage and genuine despair. 24 years of marriage, and this is how it ends? With you gloating over my financial destruction while admitting you lied to me throughout our entire divorce? I protected legitimate business assets from vindictive litigation. You chose to interpret privacy as fraud and spent your settlement trying to prove allegations that were ultimately meaningless. We both made choices, Victoria. You just made worse ones. She walked away without responding. Her shoulders slumped with the weight of complete defeat. I watched her disappear into the courthouse crowd, a woman who'd transformed divorce victory into total financial ruin through obsessive pursuit of justice that turned out to be worthless. The aftermath of the trial brought unexpected media attention to what journalists described as one of the most self-destructive divorce cases in Washington state legal history. Seattle newspapers covered Victoria's financial deterioration as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting resentment drive expensive legal decisions. though they were careful to present both sides of the story sympathetically. Victoria disappeared from public view after the trial, apparently moving to her sister's house in Portland while trying to rebuild from complete financial devastation. Her social media presence, which had documented both her divorce triumph and subsequent investigation, went silent entirely. The woman who'd once celebrated claiming 60% of my assets was now dependent on family charity. Meanwhile, my business continued expanding with resources that no longer needed to remain hidden. The offshore account that had funded Chen Holdings USA could now operate transparently, supporting continued acquisition and growth without requiring elaborate privacy measures. Victoria's investigation had inadvertently created publicity that attracted additional investment opportunities and business partnerships. 6 months after the trial, I received an unexpected phone call from Harrison, Victoria's former attorney. His tone was professionally neutral, but I could detect underlying embarrassment about his role in Victoria's self-destruction. "Marcus, I'm calling on behalf of Victoria Chen regarding a potential settlement of outstanding issues from her civil lawsuit. I thought Judge Coleman dismissed her case completely." She did, but Victoria is considering an appeal based on allegations of asset concealment during divorce proceedings. However, she'd be willing to waive any further legal action in exchange for a modest settlement that would help her reestablish financial stability. The request was pathetic and somehow fitting. Victoria was trying to monetize her own humiliation, seeking payment for agreeing not to pursue appeals that had no realistic chance of success. She'd spent everything trying to prove asset concealment, and now she was trying to sell her agreement not to appeal a case she'd already lost. What kind of settlement is she seeking? $100,000 in exchange for a complete waiver of any future claims related to your marriage, divorce, or alleged asset concealment. It would provide closure for both parties and allow Victoria to start over financially. The offer revealed how completely Victoria's situation had deteriorated. She was asking for $100,000 to stop pursuing legal action she couldn't afford to continue, essentially begging for charity from the man she'd spent 2 years trying to destroy. Her perfect revenge had devolved into desperate plea bargaining. "Tell Victoria I'm not interested in purchasing her agreement to stop harassing me," I replied. "She created this situation through her own choices, and she can live with the consequences." Harrison's sigh was audible over the phone line. "I understand your position, Marcus. I'll convey your response to Victoria." 2 years after receiving those initial divorce papers, I was sitting in the executive office of Chen Holdings USA, reviewing quarterly reports that showed annual revenues approaching $60 million. The company had grown beyond my original expectations, benefiting from market conditions and strategic acquisitions that had positioned us as a major regional construction firm. The offshore account that had started everything remained active, though it no longer needed to be hidden. Patricia Morrison had restructured it as a legitimate international investment vehicle that provided additional diversification for my growing business empire. What had begun as financial protection had become the foundation for genuine wealth. Victoria's story had become something of a legend in Seattle's legal community, told as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting divorce resentment drive destructive decision-making. Attorneys used her case to counsel clients about the importance of accepting reasonable settlements rather than pursuing expensive investigations based on speculation. I occasionally wondered about her current situation, though I felt no sympathy for someone who'd chosen vindictive litigation over financial security. She'd achieved everything she'd claimed to want in our divorce settlement, then destroyed it all pursuing proof of something that couldn't help her even when proven true. The final irony was that Victoria had been absolutely correct about my asset concealment. Her suspicious thinking had identified real deception, and her investigation had eventually forced me to disclose information I'd successfully hidden throughout our divorce proceedings. She'd achieved complete vindication of her allegations while simultaneously destroying herself financially. Justice, I reflected, sometimes came in forms that nobody anticipated. Victoria had sought to punish me for neglecting our marriage and hiding assets during our divorce. Instead, she'd punished herself while providing me with the foundation for building wealth that exceeded anything we'd accumulated together.
The offshore account that she'd spent 2 years trying to prove now funded business operations that employed over 300 people across 4 states. Her perfect revenge had become my perfect opportunity, transforming hidden assets into legitimate empire building that would have been impossible without her unknowing assistance. Sometimes, the best revenge was simply letting your enemies destroy themselves while you built something better from the wreckage of their failed schemes. Victoria had taught me that lesson more thoroughly than she'd ever intended. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.